Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to plunge into some really big questions, sift through the layers, and hopefully pull out those surprising insights that make you feel genuinely well-informed. And today we are tackling a huge one, a really profound paradox right at the heart of, well, us, human existence. How can a species that seems overwhelmingly made up of, hardworking, honest, family-focused, peaceful people, how can we also have a history so full of conflict, oppression, betrayal? It seems contradictory.
It absolutely does. It's a massive question, isn't it? And this deep dive, it's really built on quite an extensive science-backed analysis looking at human reliability cooperation.
Right.
And our mission really is to try and unravel that paradox. We'll be digging into the, let's say, the evolutionary and social tension between these two big strategies we seem to have, our amazing ability for in-group cooperation, and also our, well, pretty potent drive for intergroup competition. We're pulling together insights from philosophy, biology, sociology, even game theory to try and make sense of it.
Exactly. We're aiming for those aha moments, those practical takeaways that help you understand not just what we're like, but crucially, why we act the way we do. And what that might mean for, actually building a better, more balanced society. So, okay, let's unpack this. Before we even get into the cracks, the conflicts, we really need to appreciate the powerful architecture that actually holds human societies together.
Absolutely.
How is it that the reliability of the average person isn't just luck, but something like deeply evolved and constructed into who we are?
Well, you could almost think of it like society has a kind of philosophical operating system. And the core idea there is the social contract.
Right, the social contract. The idea that our moral obligations, they kind of stem from an agreement we make to form society. But what's the real push? Why do we voluntarily give up some individual freedom for collective rules? Feels a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It really does. And, the classic philosophers absolutely wrestled with this. You take someone like Thomas Hobbes. He famously argued that without some kind of strong central authority, the natural state of humanity would just be chaos, a perpetual state of war, every man against every man, as he put it.
Grim.
Yeah, really grim. Life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So for Hobbes, reliability isn't chosen, it's basically coerced. You obey because you fear the alternative. But then you have someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had a much more optimistic view.
Right, the noble savage idea.
Exactly. He thought humans were naturally good, peaceful, and it was society, particularly things like private property, that actually corrupted us.
So the opposite view, really.
Pretty much. For Rousseau, the social contract isn't about escaping a nightmare state. It's more about restoring that lost freedom and goodness. He talked about the general will, this idea of the collective interest of the people.
Okay.
And what's really fascinating there, the general will points to something crucial: legitimacy.
Legitimacy.
Yeah. Social rules, laws, they're only really followed consistently if people perceive them as fair, as serving the common good. If a rule feels illegitimate, if it doesn't align with people's values, well, that reliability just starts to crumble.
That's a really key distinction. Okay, so if that's the sort of philosophical why of reliability, then the how it actually works day to day must involve trust. Right?
Absolutely. Trust is fundamental.
And there's a big difference, isn't there, between just, say, relying on your alarm clock to go off and actually trusting a friend to keep a secret. That feeling of betrayal if they don't, that's different. It's not just disappointment.
Precisely. That sting of betrayal, not just, annoyance or disappointment, that's the hallmark of violated trust. And philosophers have really dug into this. Some see trust simply as a belief you believe someone will act reliably. Others view it more as an emotion, an effective attitude, maybe a kind of felt optimism.
Felt optimism, I like that.
Yeah. But I think Richard Holton's idea of the participant stance really gets at it. He argues that when you trust someone, you're not just predicting their behavior like you predict the sun rising. You're placing a normative expectation on them.
Meaning you expect them to do the right thing morally?
Yes. You expect them to recognize that expectation and act accordingly. And if they don't, you feel betrayed. So for society to function smoothly, we need what you might call warranted trust. Trust that's actually justified by the other person's trustworthiness.
So bringing this back to you, the listener, reliability isn't just about things working like clockwork. It's about consistently meeting these shared, often unspoken, moral expectations. It's enacted every single day through countless acts of trust. It's kind of the blueprint for how we live together and also the lubricant that keeps the whole social engine running. It's amazing, really, that something so seemingly fragile felt optimism, unspoken rules, oils the gears of civilization.
It really is. And you can see how quickly things grind to a halt when that trust breaks down, not just between individuals, but across society.
Okay, so philosophy gives us the why and how in terms of ideas. But here's where it gets really interesting for me. The biology. Why are humans apparently built to form societies in the first place?
Yeah.
How is our reliability actually rooted in, well, evolution?
Right. This is a huge puzzle for evolutionary theory because on the surface, altruism, helping others at a cost to yourself seems like it should be selected against, doesn't it?
Yeah, survival of the fittest sounds pretty selfish.
Exactly. But evolution is clever. It's found several really powerful ways to make cooperation pay off. The first one is probably the most obvious: kin selection.
Helping your relatives.
Right. This is why we tend to be so family-oriented. By helping those who share our genes, we indirectly help those genes get passed on. There's even a mathematical formula, Hamilton's rule, basically RBC, meaning if the genetic relatedness times the benefit to the recipient is greater than the cost to the helper, then the altruistic behavior is likely to evolve and spread. It makes mathematical sense to sacrifice for close kin.
Okay, so that explains family loyalty. What else?
Then you have reciprocal altruism. This is the classic, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. This underpins a lot of our honest and hardworking traits. But for it to work, you need sophisticated abilities. Recognizing individuals, remembering past interactions, reputation matters hugely, and feeling those moral emotions like gratitude when someone helps you, and anger or indignation when someone cheats you.
So emotions are key for managing reciprocity.
Absolutely. And then there's a third, maybe more controversial idea: group selection or multi-level selection, championed by people like E.O. Wilson.
How did that work?
The basic idea is that, sure, within any single group, selfish individuals might outperform altruists, but, and this is the key, groups composed of cooperative, altruistic individuals are likely to outcompete groups of selfish individuals.
So cooperation wins at the group level.
Exactly. This creates an evolutionary pressure favoring traits like group cohesion, loyalty, self-sacrifice for the group.
So evolution gives us these cooperative pushes. But how does that translate into our psychology, our actual decision-making? You mentioned a kind of innate moral grammar.
That's a great way to think about it. This is where moral foundations theory, or MFT, comes in. It suggests our minds aren't blank slates morally. We come equipped with these foundational sensitivities.
Like building blocks for morality.
Kind of, yeah. There's the care-harm foundation, sensitivity to suffering, kindness, very obvious evolutionary roots. Then fairness cheating, crucial for that reciprocal altruism we just talked about: justice, rights, managing exchanges.
Okay.
Then there are what MFT calls the binding foundations: loyalty betrayal, forming cohesive groups; patriotism, authority subversion, navigating social hierarchies, respecting traditions; sanctity degradation, originally maybe about avoiding pathogens, but extends to ideas of purity, sacredness, avoiding contaminants, both physical and moral.
And wasn't there a newer one added?
Yes, liberty oppression. This taps into our resistance to being dominated or coerced.
And some of these focus more on the individual, others more on the group.
Exactly. Care and fairness are often called individualizing foundations. They protect individuals. Loyalty, authority, and sanctity are binding. They help bind individuals into strong cooperative groups. And these foundations, MFT argues, provide the basic psychological toolkit for making moral judgments. It helps explain why you see similar kinds of rules and institutions pop up in very different cultures. Everyone's working with roughly the same set of evolved moral tools, just, emphasizing different ones or expressing them differently.
So these individual actions, driven by our biology, our evolved moral psychology, how do they scale up? How do they actually build collective strength in society? This brings us to social cohesion, right?
Right. Social cohesion is sort of the emergent property of all these reliable individuals interacting. You can define it as the willingness of members of society to cooperate. It's the glue.
The glue, okay.
It's built on things we've touched on: shared values, a sense of belonging, strong social bonds, and of course, trust. Social norms, the unwritten rules of behavior, act like the threads weaving this social fabric together. And again, whether people follow those norms really depends on whether they see them as legitimate, as fair.
And this isn't just a nice feeling, it has real benefits.
Oh, absolutely. The data is quite clear. Communities with higher social cohesion, higher social capital, tend to have better public health outcomes, lower rates of violence, greater collective efficacy, meaning they're just better at getting things done together, solving local problems.
Okay, and if we want a more concrete way to picture this social fabric, network theory can help, thinking about nodes and ties.
Yes. Network theory gives us a powerful visual. Individuals or groups are the nodes, and the relationships between them are the ties. And there's a really important distinction between strong ties and weak ties.
Strong ties are family, close friends.
Exactly. High trust, lots of emotional intensity, frequent contact. They tend to form dense clusters. Everyone knows everyone. Great for deep support, local trust.
And weak ties.
Those are your more casual acquaintances. The person you chat with at the coffee shop, a colleague in another department, they often act as bridges between those dense clusters.
And why are they important? Seems like strong ties are where the real action is.
You'd think so, but weak ties are surprisingly crucial. They're often the conduits for new information, fresh perspectives, job opportunities, things that might not circulate within your tight-knit group.
Ah, okay. So they connect different worlds.
Precisely. And this raises a really important point for society as a whole. A healthy social structure probably needs both. You need that robust skeleton of strong ties for stability and deep trust, but you also need that rich web of weak ties connecting everything, allowing for innovation, information flow, broader social integration.
And the resources flowing through this whole network, the trust, the info, the favors, that's social capital.
That's social capital. It's the value embedded in those social networks.
It's fascinating how similar structures emerge. Despite all the surface differences between cultures, do we see common patterns globally in how societies are built, these cultural universals?
We absolutely do. The anthropologist Donald Brown compiled a huge list. Things like language always having grammar, recognizing family and kin, having moral sentiments, laws or rules, engaging in cooperative labor, using tools, having weapons.
So basic building blocks are shared.
Exactly. It's strong evidence for a shared human nature, a common toolkit for solving the fundamental problems of social living. The specific styles vary enormously, of course, but the underlying architecture, the need for reliable cooperation and structure, seems universal.
Okay, so everything we've discussed so far paints a picture of humans as fundamentally cooperative, built for connection, driven to create reliable societies. Which brings us right back to the paradox. If we're so geared towards cooperation, why the constant conflict? Why the oppression, the betrayal? And the uncomfortable answer seems to be, it's the flip side of the same coin.
That is the absolute core of it. The very psychological mechanisms that allow us to form these incredibly tight, cooperative, loyal in-groups. They're precisely the same mechanisms that can fuel suspicion, hostility, and competition towards outgroups. Our minds evolved to navigate a world of competing coalitions, not necessarily to embrace all of humanity equally.
Us versus them.
Exactly. Social identity theory really explores this. We have this innate tendency to categorize ourselves and others into groups, us and them, and it happens incredibly quickly. Sometimes, based on the flimsiest criteria, experiments show you can create in-group favoritism in minutes over something totally arbitrary, like preference for a painter.
The minimal group experiment.
Right, and once those categories are formed, biases kick in. We tend to see our own group successes as due to our great character, our failures as bad luck. But for the outgroup, it's the reverse. Their failures show their flawed character. Their successes are just luck or circumstance.
Double standards, basically.
Pretty much. And this bias can easily tip over into active hostility, outgroup derogation, especially if that outgroup is perceived as some kind of threat. A threat to physical safety, economic resources, or maybe even core values and way of life.
And this helps answer that query about why groups might try to, quote, get rid of other cultures.
It provides a psychological mechanism, sadly, yes. And those binding moral foundations we talked about earlier, loyalty, authority, sanctity, they can be, well, weaponized in these situations. Loyalty to us demands suspicion of them. Their ways might be framed as subversive to our authority or tradition. Their practices might be seen as impure or degrading to our sacred values. It can provide a moral justification, however warped, for exclusion, conflict, even elimination.
It's quite chilling how those very things that create community can be twisted. So biologically, when these tensions flare up, what's going on? What about aggression?
Aggression is complex biologically. There's a constant interplay in the brain. You've got the amygdala, sort of the threat detector, the alarm bell that can trigger aggressive responses. And then you have the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, the part that's supposed to put the brakes on impulsive behavior.
Okay.
A lot of studies link impulsive violence to reduced activity in that prefrontal cortex, weaker brakes, and sometimes hyperactivity in the amygdala, a hyperactive alarm bell.
So impulse control is key.
Very much so. Neurochemistry plays a role too. Low levels of serotonin are often linked with poor impulse control. Excess dopamine can sometimes increase aggression. And testosterone doesn't necessarily cause aggression, but it can amplify it, especially in response to status threats or challenges.
And there's psychological conditions too.
Right. Certain conditions like bipolar disorder, PTSD, antisocial personality disorder, they can unfortunately increase the risks of aggressive behavior interacting with these biological systems.
So aggression isn't some alien force. It's more like a potential behavior pattern hardwired to some extent, but triggered or inhibited by specific brain systems and presumably environmental cues.
That's a good way to put it. It's part of our complex human potential, a reminder of that inherent duality we're exploring.
Okay, so if we want to bring in some calculations and logical arguments, as the query put it, how does game theory help model this tension between cooperation and competition?
Game theory is fantastic for this because it strips down complex social interactions into strategic choices where your outcome depends on what others do. The classic example everyone knows is the prisoner's dilemma.
Right, two suspects interrogated separately.
Exactly. Alice and Bob, no communication. If they both stay silent, cooperate with each other, they both get a light sentence, maybe 1 year. If Alice betrays Bob, defects, while Bob stays silent, Alice walks free, Bob gets 10 years, vice versa if Bob betrays Alice.
And if they both betray each other?
Then they both get a medium sentence, say 5 years. The dilemma is that for each individual, regardless of what the other does, betraying seems like the rational, self-interested choice. If Bob stays silent, Alice is better off betraying, 0 years versus 1. If Bob betrays, Alice is still better off betraying, 5 years versus 10.
So rational self-interest leads them both to betray, even though they'd both be better off if they both cooperated.
Precisely. That's the paradox. It shows how individual rationality can lead to collective irrationality. But, and this is crucial, things change if the game is played repeatedly. The iterated prisoner's dilemma.
Because reputation comes into play.
Exactly, and the shadow of the future. If you know you'll interact with this person again, cooperating now might build trust for future gains. Strategies like tit for tat start by cooperating, then just copy whatever the other player did last time turn out to be incredibly effective in simulations. It shows how cooperation can emerge and be sustained, even among self-interested actors, if the conditions are right.
That's a hopeful spin. Are there other games that model trust more directly?
Yes, the trust game is designed specifically for that. You have an investor who gets some money, say $10. They can send any amount of it to a trustee. Whatever they send gets tripled. Then the trustee decides how much of that tripled amount, if any, to send back to the investor.
So it measures the investor's willingness to trust and the trustee's trustworthiness or reciprocity.
Exactly. It quantifies those very things. And then there's the tragedy of the commons, which isn't a two-player game like the others, but it's hugely relevant.
This explains environmental problems and traffic.
It explains a lot of situations involving shared, finite resources. Imagine a common pasture open to all local herders. Each herder thinks, if I add one more cow, I get all the benefit from that cow, but the cost of slightly overgrazing the pasture is shared among everyone. So it's rational for me to add another cow.
And if everyone thinks that way,
the pasture gets destroyed, ruined for everyone. It applies directly to overfishing, pollution, deforestation, and yes, even traffic jams. Each driver makes a rational choice to use the road, contributing just a little bit to the congestion until the whole system grinds to a halt.
So reliability isn't fixed. It's often a strategic choice influenced by the rules of the game, the payoffs. Game theory really shows that if we want more cooperation, we often need to change the rules, change the incentives.
That's a key takeaway. You have to make cooperation the rational, rewarding choice.
So what happens when the whole architecture just fails? When unreliability becomes widespread, how do sociologists explain deviance, breaking the rules?
There are a few key perspectives. Social control theory, associated with Travis Hershey, flips the usual question. Instead of asking, why do people break rules, it asks, why don't most people break rules most of the time?
And the answer is?
Strong social bonds. Hershey identified 4 types. Attachment, caring about others' opinions. Commitment, investment in conventional society, like education or career. Involvement, being busy with legitimate activities. And belief, accepting society's moral rules. Deviance happens when these bonds are weak or absent.
So it's about lack of connection, not necessarily some positive motivation to do bad.
Largely, yes, according to this theory. Then you have conflict theory, which sees society more as an arena of power struggles between groups.
Rich versus poor, powerful versus powerless.
Exactly. From this viewpoint, laws and norms aren't neutral. They're often created by dominant groups to maintain their power and control resources. So what gets defined as deviant might actually be behavior that challenges the status quo, or simply the result of systemic inequality.
Okay, and labeling theory.
Labeling theory focuses on the reaction to rule breaking. It argues that deviance isn't inherent in an act itself, but rather a consequence of society successfully applying a deviant label to someone. Once you're labeled a delinquent or a criminal or whatever, it can change how people see you, how you see yourself, and limit your opportunities, potentially pushing you further into that role. It can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you can see how these theories connect, right? Someone marginalized by inequality, conflict theory might have weaker social bonds, social control theory, leading them to commit an act society deems deviant. They get caught and labeled, labeling theory, which further weakens their bonds and opportunities, making future deviance more likely.
It's a potential vicious cycle. And when this breakdown becomes pervasive, when trust completely evaporates, that's when we risk societal collapse.
That's the ultimate failure of reliability, yes. And history shows collapse is usually not a sudden event, but a long, slow decline. Think of the Western Roman Empire or the classic Maya. A common thread in many collapses is the erosion of public trust.
Trust in institutions, in leaders.
Both, often driven by things like rampant corruption, extreme inequality, the perception that the system is rigged, or a consistent failure of the leadership to solve critical problems like famine or security threats. When that happens, the social contract essentially dissolves. People stop believing the rules are legitimate, stop cooperating, and the society loses its ability to function effectively.
Wow. Okay, so this whole deep dive has painted a really complex picture. Human reliability is this dynamic thing, full of contradictions, this constant push and pull between cooperation and competition. A perfect utopia might be out of reach.
Probably, yes.
But understanding these dynamics scientifically gives us real tools, doesn't it? Tools to maybe nudge things in a better direction.
I think so. It helps us be more realistic and maybe more effective.
So how do we apply all this? How do we try and build a more reliable, maybe more prosperous world? One huge challenge seems to be this ethical tightrope. How do we even define a proper human culture, as the query asked, without just imposing our own values on everyone else? That tension between universal values and cultural relativism.
That is a massive ongoing debate. On one side, you have universalism, the idea that certain fundamental moral principles apply everywhere. Think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Right.
On the other side, cultural relativism argues that values are entirely shaped by culture, so there's no universal standard to judge different cultures by. What's right here might be wrong there, and vice versa.
And both extremes seem dangerous.
They really do. Extreme universalism can lead to moral imperialism. Our way is the only right way. But extreme relativism can lead to justifying horrific practices, well, that's just their culture, about things like slavery or female genital mutilation.
Where's the middle ground?
Many people advocate for something like weak cultural relativism. The idea is you start with a strong presumption of universality for core aspects of human dignity and basic rights, but you also acknowledge that cultures will have legitimate variations in how they interpret and implement those principles in practice.
How does moral foundations theory fit here?
It offers a potentially useful framework. We could argue for robust universal protection for those individualizing foundations, care, preventing harm, fairness, justice, rights, maybe liberty, resisting oppression. These seem crucial for basic human dignity. But we could allow for more cultural variation in how the binding foundations, loyalty, authority, sanctity are expressed, as long as they don't end up violating those core individual rights. It's about finding a balance between respecting diversity and upholding fundamental human decency.
Okay, that makes sense as a theoretical approach. But can we ground this in reality? What does the data say about actual human values around the world? The World Values Survey.
Yes, the WVS is an incredible resource. It's been tracking values and beliefs in nearly 100 countries since the early 80s. One of their main tools is the Inglehart-Welzel Cultural Map. It plots countries on two dimensions, one axis running from traditional to secular rational values, and the other from survival to self-expression values.
And what does the recent data, say from Wave 7, tell us about things related to reliability?
Some fascinating points emerge. Take family kinship. Almost 89% globally say family is very important. That's huge confirmation of its universal significance, linking right back to kin selection.
So family loyalty is near universal.
Seems so. What about work ethic? Around 70% globally rate work as very important. This tends to be higher in societies focused on survival values and often decreases a bit as societies become more economically secure and shift towards self-expression.
Interesting. What about honesty, fairness?
Well, one question asks about the justifiability of claiming government benefits to which you are not entitled, and globally, a significant chunk find it at least somewhat justifiable. This can be seen as a proxy for willingness to cheat the system, and it often correlates negatively with trust in institutions.
Right. And peace versus security.
There's big variation. When asked to choose between priorities like economic growth and strong defense forces, the preference for strong defense is much higher in countries with lower existential security, more instability, or perceived threats from neighbors. Makes sense, right?
Yeah. Context matters hugely. And the big one, social trust.
Ah, yes, the classic question. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you need to be very careful in dealing with people? Globally, the need to be very careful camp significantly outnumbers the most people can be trusted camp.
So generally low trust societies are the norm.
High trust societies are still relatively rare, unfortunately. And low social trust, low social capital is strongly linked to things like higher corruption, political instability, lower economic performance.
So summing up the WVS data, we're strongly wired for reliability within close groups, like family.
Definitely.
But extending that deep trust and reliable cooperation to the broader society, to strangers, to institutions, that remains a major global challenge.
That seems to be the picture, yes.
Which brings us right back to that user-specific query.
Yeah.
What constitutes a proper human culture to elect a leader? How do we build that broader trust, especially in our political systems?
Well, political scientists talk about a society's political culture. Almond and Verba famously identify three main types. Parochial, where people have very little awareness of or engagement with national government, maybe more focused on local or tribal structures.
Okay.
Subject, where people are aware of the government but relate to it passively. They obey its laws, pay taxes, but don't really feel they can influence it. Think traditional monarchies or authoritarian states.
Mm-hmm.
And participant, where people believe they can and should participate in the political process, influence outcomes, hold leaders accountable.
And the ideal for democracy is?
They argued the most stable, effective democracies tend to have a blend they called the civic culture. It's primarily participant, but retains some subject elements, respect for law, and parochial elements, focus on private life, to provide balance and prevent hyper-politicization.
Okay, so the culture matters. What about the institutions themselves? Good governance.
Absolutely critical. You can think of the principles of good governance as basically institutionalized reliability at the state level. What does that include?
Things like?
Legitimacy. People voluntarily accept the government's right to rule, not just obeying out of fear. Transparency. Information about government actions and decisions is accessible to the public. Accountability. Officials can actually be held responsible for their actions through elections, audits, legal processes, and crucially, the rule of law. Everyone, including the rulers, is subject to the law. Laws are applied fairly and predictably, preventing arbitrary power.
And if you connect that back to game theory.
Exactly. These principles are, in many ways, brilliant institutional solutions to the problems game theory highlights, like the prisoner's dilemma or the tragedy of the commons. They change the rules of the game.
How so?
Transparency makes it harder for leaders or officials to defect or cheat secretly. Accountability raises the cost of corruption or incompetence. You might lose the next election or face prosecution. The rule of law creates a stable, predictable environment where long-term cooperation, investment, and trust make rational sense. It shifts the payoffs to favor cooperation and reliability.
So putting it all together, a proper culture for electing leaders isn't just about having elections. It's about fostering a participant civic culture where citizens are engaged and actively select leaders who seem to demonstrate those key foundations like care and fairness. And, just as importantly, it's about building and maintaining strong institutions based on transparency, accountability, rule of law that constantly check the potential downsides of our groupish nature. Things like cronyism, tribalism, authoritarian impulses, making sure they don't undermine that broader social trust and cooperation.
That captures it really well. It's an ongoing process, building and maintaining that kind of culture and those kinds of institutions.
So this deep dive has really shown that human reliability is complex. It's not fixed. It's this dynamic dance between our cooperative side and our competitive groupish side. A perfect world might be impossible.
Almost certainly.
But understanding the science behind it all gives us real practical tools, doesn't it?
I believe so. It moves us beyond just wishful thinking.
So, based on everything we've discussed, what are some key evidence-based recommendations if we want to consciously foster a more cooperative, more reliable world?
We could probably boil it down to 4 main areas. First, promote education focused on moral reasoning and systems thinking. Help people understand different moral perspectives, cognitive empathy, how complex systems work. This can directly combat polarization and simplistic us versus them thinking.
Okay, education. What else?
Second, design institutions to deliberately align self-interest with the collective good. We need to consciously change the rules of the game to make cooperation pay off. Think carbon taxes for pollution, strong anti-corruption measures, whistleblower protections, things that alter those payoff matrices we talked about.
Makes sense.
Third, actively foster broader overlapping identities. Find ways to expand people's sense of us. Emphasize shared goals, common humanity, maybe through cross-group collaborations, shared public spaces, storytelling that highlights connection rather than division.
Expand the circle of us.
Exactly. And finally, fourth, invest in social capital as if it were critical infrastructure. Because it is. This means supporting public libraries, parks, community centers, local arts, civic organizations, all the places and groups where people build face-to-face trust, strengthen those weak ties, and practice cooperation.
Education, aligning incentives, broadening identities, and investing in social capital. That's a powerful framework.
It gives us concrete places to start, at least.
Okay, so let's leave you, our listener, with a final thought to chew on. Considering everything we've discussed today about our evolved instincts, our moral foundations, the rules of the game in society, the power of trust and cooperation, what's one small change you could champion in a shared resource you rely on? Maybe it's your local park, a volunteer group, how your workplace team shares tasks, or even just how your family manages chores. What's one tweak you could make to the rules or the environment to make cooperation the most rewarding, most natural choice for everyone involved?
That's a great question to ponder.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
This is DigitView.